Okay, thank you. This is a final session to try and sum up. We've moved some of the audience up onto the stage, our speakers who are still here. My name's David Runciman. With John Norton, I help oversee this Technology and Democracy project that comes under the auspices of. I'm very sorry I couldn't be here this morning, so I missed what I hear were some really fascinating sessions, and I can't really sum up because I don't know everything that was said, but I'm just going to say a few general themes because I've been here this afternoon. It's been fascinating, some of the things that struck me, and then just pose some questions to give everyone a chance to say one or two concluding remarks. And John may want to say something as well. One of the themes of the overarching project on technology and democracy and that came up today is it's not a question, it's an assumption that we share, which is that this time is different. There is something different about this technology revolution and its social and political implications, which means that one of the challenges is to know which historical analogies hold and which don't. And I think we got a real sense of it today, which is to try and make sense of this, we all reach for historical analogies because we can't understand the thing that we're living through, but we reach for historical analogies that may well not actually be analogous. So even this afternoon, we heard it's a bit like having the curtains taken off your front room. And it's a bit like having someone open your mail. And it's a bit like having your phone tapped. And it's a bit like being tagged, to go through a series of historical forms of surveillance. And maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. And that's one of the questions. And people are often looking for the analogy that they think will drive home to people that they ought to take this more seriously. So they say, you read articles that say things like, imagine if an agent of the state was actually standing outside your house and watching everything that came in and came out. And then when they saw something they didn't like, without you knowing it, they reserved to themselves the right to open that piece of mail or to research the background of the person. You wouldn't like that, hoping for the response, no, I wouldn't, so I don't like this. But what if the response is, well, I don't mind this, so it must be nothing like that. And that seems to me just as plausible a response, and that's one of the challenges here. So one question is, if anyone wants to address it, just whether these historical analogies do hold, do we think? One of the ways in which this time maybe is different, and we've heard about it this afternoon again, and maybe this morning too, is in relation to state capacity. Because historically, I think it's been assumed that privacy, which is a primarily modern phenomenon, falls within the remit of the state. States have the capacity to regulate it. States decide where to draw the line. And so the fundamental question is a question about where states ought to draw the line. They have that capacity, and we want to know how they should use it responsibly. But maybe they no longer have the capacity to draw the line. And that's one of the things that I think came up this afternoon. And we heard things for which there is, I think, no historical analogy. For instance, I think it was David who said, states need protecting. We need to actually sort of look out for them because they're drowning in this data too. We actually, it's our job as citizens to save our poor states from being overwhelmed by this. I can't think of a historical analogy for that. But I think it's also true that we heard this afternoon as I was listening and I was thinking about this, which is that there are some really fundamental mismatches going on here, and that it may be that the capacity for this exists at the international level. It may be that the EU, that political legal institution, has the capacity and the slack in the system to possibly regulate in this area, but it lacks the legitimacy to do it. I mean, this country may be about to exit the only legal political entity that has the capacity to regulate in this area. If Britain becomes free from the EU, it's not like the British state is suddenly going to work out how to do this. The thing that has the legitimacy, which is the state, may not have the capacity. And then we heard a bit again in David's talk about that there have been historical periods where there was a kind of trade-off between citizens and states, in which citizens recognized that in return for handing things over, privacy, to the state, they were getting things in return, services, welfare functions. Well, that is still going on, but it's not with the state, it's with Google and Facebook. And in relation to Ruben's talk at the end, there is a transaction going on. It's free. It's not sell, it's free. We're giving it to them free, and they're giving us the services free. It's a very, very political relationship. In some senses, it's quite a socialist relationship. It's free. And it has both the advantages and disadvantages of this. I mean, a feature that I think is neglected, I've talked to John a lot about a lot about this in the past. I'm not sure if he agrees, but I mean, I think it's fundamentally redistributive in that our data is not worth the same. If your income is $1 million a year, they much would rather see your search patterns than if your income is $1,000 a year. But we're both giving that over for free in return for free services. So there is something redistributive going on there, which wouldn't be the case if we sold it. But at the same time, it's also socialist in the sense it is accumulating vast amounts of power with the agents that are regulating this process. But it's not states. It's the guy who was on the cover of The Economist presented as a Roman emperor. It's Zuckerberg. That seems to me completely disanalogous with the past. And then the other feature, again, which often comes up in this, is which is almost kind of its bathos. So much of it's driven by advertising. That seems to me not a historical analogy, that we're asking these fundamental philosophical questions about privacy and identity and rights. And a lot of it is being driven by advertising. And I think, Ruben, you called it surveillance-driven advertising, but it's also advertising-driven surveillance. I don't think there is any historical, I don't think in the past advertising was driving this. So that seems to me completely disanalogous. So there are those questions too. And then just to remind people of some of the questions that Daniel and Nora offered in the prospectus for this conference. And again, a couple that I know have been discussed already, but just to remind people of them. One of which, and if anyone wants to say anything more about this, one of which was the relationship between privacy and anonymity. And we heard that this afternoon, anonymity is a power. It's like a superpower. And privacy isn't. That is a big difference. And so the way I tend to think about it is that anonymity is the cloak that people put on when they want to intrude on the world. And privacy is the cloak they reach for when the world is intruding on them. Anonymity is much more active. But it's almost like we want the defenders of privacy to be active in the way that the kind of people who are out there anonymously abusing other people are. We want to turn privacy into a power. And sometimes it is a power, but it tends to be a right, whereas anonymity, which sometimes is a right, is more of a power. And that I don't think we've worked out that relationship at all. And then the final thing, which I know John is particularly interested in, is this phrase that we hear a lot, and again, I know it's been touched on today, which is if you've got nothing to fear, you've got nothing to hide. And one of the questions I know John wants to know the answer to, and we just don't know, which is why does that keep coming up? And a lot of people do seem to accept it. And this again must be one of the ways in which this is different. I mean, for instance, if someone did remove all the curtains from your house and said you're not allowed to have curtains on any of your rooms, including, and then said, but if you've got nothing to fear, you've got nothing to hide, people would of course not think that that was a justification. So the analogy simply wouldn't hold. So that can't be the right analogy because people don't seem to mind about this. But why is it? And again, we heard it. The journalists, the journalists who should be the ones who most passionately are still saying, well, but if you've got nothing to fear, you've got nothing to hide. Why does that have such a hold when it seems to many people to be completely false? So there are some. Pretty good set of answers. I know. So those are some thoughts and some questions, but it's really to give anyone who wants a chance to sort of sum up, and it's just to also highlight some of the overarching themes of our project. And I'm not going to do anything more than now. Just speak in whatever order you like.
Can I also? I'd just like to take maybe three of those things because they're interrelated. First of all, the reason people are willing to hand over information. The difference, I think, is that people do care about privacy when they understand what is happening to their information, and that's been shown in study after study after study. When you really, including that app study, that when people have no idea that when they bought this app or downloaded it. I mean, who reads 52 pages of your agreement? So people don't know where the information is going, and what they look for is the simplicity of the cool stuff. They don't look at what lies behind it, and that again is related both to then, if you have nothing. Yeah,
I realised I was doing it the wrong way around, wasn't I? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, but if you have nothing,
it doesn't really matter which way around.
Well, but if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide.
Yeah, that's to hide. You have nothing to fear.
It's related to that. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It's related to that because yet again, people can't see that analogy. It seems such a logical statement to make because if you're dealing in an analog world, I might think, well, I have, I don't care if somebody searches my handbag going into an event because I have nothing to hide, and I'm trading that one small momentary piece of my privacy in order to access a communal thing that I want to go to. But that to me is quite different from these large scale surveillance capabilities. And then just to conclude, with the final point is, interestingly, in Ireland, we have no such thing as a class action lawsuit. That is not recognized in law. But Digital Rights Ireland, in bringing this constitutional challenge to the government over data retention, was granted permission by the court to bring that case. Normally you have to have a person who's been injured, a party that's been injured, to bring the case. Like Max Schrems, for example, taking the case on that ended up being about safe harbor. Again, because an Irish judge recognized the real question was safe harbor. That wasn't Max Schrems' original case at all, although he's happy to take credit for all of it now. That had nothing to do with Max Schrems' case until after the fact. But it was the Irish High Court decided that the questions of this kind of pervasive surveillance were beyond what the average citizen could understand. It was too complex and too large scale and reached too far into personal life for people to even see that it was happening. And so therefore, DRI had a right to represent, because it understood these issues, had a right to bring this case on behalf of the Irish public, even though it wasn't a single person within DRI saying, I'm personally injured by this. So you do have this recognized at a quite high level that, and I think this is all interconnected, individuals have a very hard time understanding these things because what happens is pervasive and way behind what we see on the front end. And so simple explanations of what's being done sound sensible when they aren't. And that the exchange seems very simple, the cool app for data, but we really don't understand what's being taken and what ends up happening with that data. So that's my
And
piece.
I think just to add to that, in terms of the, nothing to hide and nothing to fear, is that if we conceptualize cyber as a continuum and think about this space, if we think on the far right, we have industry. And of course, this, nothing to hide, it's a form of mass propaganda, because the cost, the taking away of the not allowing industry to profit from the use of people's data, that's a problem. So on the far right of this continuum, we have industry who have a motive to keep this space as unregulated as possible because it takes away from the bottom line. On the far left, we have the keyboard warriors, the freedom of the internet brigade, who also have a motive to keep the internet unregulated. But that's one of idealism. But these two are aligned in cyberspace. And the rest of us, the 99.9% of us and our children, we get to live in the middle with no say about what this space looks like, apart from being caught between these two vested interests.
I want to add into the conversation here from two perspectives. First is in the nothing to hide argument. The vast majority of the time that I've run into that argument, either through things that people have written, public statements that they've made, or in interviews, the vast majority of time it's somebody who's making a security argument, and it's meant to simply stop all conversation about privacy being in balance with security. Boom, security trumps everything. The second thing I've noticed about that is that I'm honestly trying to be really careful in what I say right now, but I cannot remember a woman ever making that argument either. I really can't. I think that there's something about caring for everyone around you and knowing that everyone has something. Everyone has something, and it's part of our job is to give them permission to have things to hide when we're human beings, right? The second thing, just to follow up on what Harlan was saying, is that I was very interested throughout this time in the difference between things that people understood intellectually and things that actually made you change your behavior, right? So violations of privacy don't necessarily make you change your behavior, even when they happen to you. So what is it about this that has actually resulted in it? And it's a little bit of a variation. What I found is that you have to feel that violation. And it may not even have to be yours. If it happens to a family member, to a dear friend, somebody who's been a victim of identity theft, whatever it happens to be. But if you have this empathic connection with this other person, it's as good as it having happened to you. So what results in changes in behavior is if you see the direct connection between what just happened, this violation that resulted from it, and now you change your behavior. And I think when we're talking, I mean, kudos to the Irish courts for realizing how few people are going to realize the incremental synergistic outcome of millions of people having their data scraped and mined and used in this way. It's just not something that we feel, that we experience in a way, that we experience somebody peeking through a window at us in the evening, right?
Can I just say a bit more about David's initial point about discontinuity? Historians, are brought up to disbelieve or mistrust arguments of discontinuity. It's part of our training. And it's particularly difficult to spot discontinuities in a liberal democracy which is built to flex, which is built to argue, which is built to shift power back and forth between the state and the private sector. You expect to see constant mini-crises, constant new forms of resolution, constant debate, constant imaginative rebalancing. And the point I was making in my paper, and it's the point that Dave picked up, is that I can't see that working much longer. It does seem to me we're reaching the end of the liberal state's capacity to cope, at least with privacy, if not for other matters. And David wasn't here, but for David Feldman this morning, I would pick up a couple of points that he made. One was that when he was setting out what law is, he said one of the things is tests of the law is it's got to be comprehensible. And in those terms, the legal controls that we've set up over government and other surveillance fail that test comprehensively and deliberately. And secondly, in answer to John Norton's point that we should worry about state surveillance, he said, no, we shouldn't, because things are getting better. Look at 1985, when we finally put the surveillance of communication under legal control. Now, the point back against that was that the first time that was asked for was in 1844. It took 114 years for the state to act. And it didn't act willingly, it acted at the point of a gun from Europe. That's why and at that point in 1985, the security services were still outside the law completely. And it was in 1989, 4 years later, that we began to put the security services inside the law. And that delay, that deliberate obscurity of powers, that refusal to debate, on its own terms works, and I can explain another time why it worked. And on its own terms, it's actually quite rational. But there was a cost to be paid for that failure, for that absence of debate, which still continues, by which I think the liberal state has disabled itself over the long run in its capacity now to act. And just final point about Europe, which it's a good point David's made. I think those seeking reform have more and more given up on the British state and looked to Europe to sort out our problems, and with good reason, which is why Brexit and also the long, deep ambition of those behind Brexit also to repeal the Human Rights Act of 1998. If both those two things happen, we really are in a very bad place, because the capacity of someone like Chris Grayling to write us a homegrown Human Rights Act which will protect privacy is 0 squared.
Barbara.
I'm going to leave behind the question of forgive me, of digital technology for a moment. I just wanted to recur to some of the points that Josh and I were making earlier about the question of the policing of the imagination in relation to hostility to privacy, and in my case, I was talking about solitude. And this has a very, I mean, in the spirit of the question of historical continuity. I mean, this has a very, very long history, but it also has, it seems to me, and this comes at the question of children from a rather different direction. It has that anxiety about the imagination seems to me to have a manifestation today in a very, very difficult area, which hasn't come up today, which is the prevent strategy. And I think, I mean, when we're talking about fear and the use of fear to try and control privacy, this is clearly something which is now going on in the schools and in the universities in relation to children and young people around. So, for example, you can see where teachers feel that they've been forced to say whether a young Muslim child seems to be more interested in religious questions than they would anticipate. Now, I mean, anyone who deals with children, of course, knows that, you know, the question of religion very often becomes an area of enormous curiosity to children, something they care about a lot. I mean, maybe only as a transition to something else, but nonetheless. And I mean, obviously, people are also looking for all sorts of other signs and so on of so-called radicalization, although, I mean, you know, sometimes in very tiny children this is happening. And I know there's tremendous unease about this in the universities, and in fact the National Union of Teachers has become out totally opposed to prevent. It's not that there's not an issue, but you know, the whole question of faith and privacy and what happens when you have a world in which religion has become such a driver, and I think religious beliefs often, whatever we may think about them, held as deep convictions, have become tremendous political forces and very frightening ones for many of us. So, and this is an area where, you know, the question of the imagination and privacy and security are all bound up in ways that terribly, terribly hard for people to think about, it seems to me. So I'd just be very curious if other people have thoughts about that.
Josh, Ruben, do you have some final reflections?
I don't have
because we have a drink outside, but we don't.
Exactly.
I'm not trying to hurry you. People have had a longer day than me. But some final thoughts?
I could just on the point you made about metaphors and whether they work. I think I share your scepticism about metaphors working on a political level. I think there are some really interesting metaphors that can be made to explain some of the technological aspects of that are kind of driving a lot of this debate. So there's a great paper which I recommend reading that was written by some researchers at Princeton, which is called "Why King George Can't Encrypt," and it's a play on a famous paper called "Why Johnny Can't Encrypt," which is about why encryption is hard to do. But it explains encryption using entirely medieval metaphors. So it talks about locks and keys and very ornate stamps that are used to authenticate documents, and it's about communication between King George and his generals, and it actually does a very good job of explaining the basic properties of public key cryptography. So I recommend that. Whether that helps us on the political level.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about listening to everybody today, but also thinking about these issues over the last few years, is the kind of the paradigm of the human self in my own psychoanalytic profession, and the kind of, you know, to be autocritical for a moment, the kind of ahistorical assumption that we make that the mind works on a kind of universal conflict model, in which the conflict is between, you know, a guilty region of the mind that has internalized prohibitions and a part of the mind that wants to do what it wants to do. Now, this kind of classical neurotic model belongs to I think, a particular period of history that maybe psychoanalysis has not been quick enough to think about. And what I think we're seeing with the rise of digital culture, and in particular with the kind of accessibility of everything to the young mind, is the possibility that really the notion of internalized prohibition, which we think of as a universal, might be one of those kind of historical structures which is going to erode, particularly actually with the availability to children of pornography and every other kind of prohibition. And that what one sees with a kind of with an avalanche of available stimuli for which there is no kind of internal rudder to navigate through them, is something more like a stimulus response model of the mind, in which there isn't a kind of deep psychological self that's been formed by prohibition. I don't think, for me, this spells either the end of privacy or the end of psychoanalysis. Embarrassing thought, but I do think that we'll have to that we're going to have to adapt to new historical conditions in the consultum and in the ways that we think.
In other words, this time is different.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was just what I was going to say. Two things. Privacy is not dead, but this time is different. But in all other respects, the range of answers we heard there just showed what a rich and interesting day this has been, and such a fascinating series of papers and talks which will be available for people to watch, I think, on the CRASSH website, and the papers will be up online. It just remains for me to thank Daniel and Nora and Judith who put on this event, and to thank everyone who's taken part. There are drinks outside. We'll continue the conversation there, and thank you to all of our speakers.